The control room was like any other that night. Rows of monitors glowing in the dark, the hum of ventilation systems, the soft clicking of keyboards. Outside, beyond the reinforced walls, the world slept. Inside, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat at his console doing what he'd done 1,000 times before. Watching. It was September 26, 1983. The Cold War wasn't a metaphor. It was the temperature of the room, the weight in your chest, the knowledge that somewhere, on the other side of the world, someone sat in a room just like this one, watching screens just like these, waiting for the same signals. The Soviet early warning system OKO had one job: detect incoming missiles, report them. Let the chain of command decide what came next. Petrov's shift had started at midnight. Now it was just past midnight again, the early hours when nothing happens, because everything's already happened or nothing will. He'd checked the systems, reviewed the protocols, settled into the rhythm of a night that felt like every other night. 44 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, a man trained not to think too much, just to see clearly and report accurately. Then the alarm sounded, not a gentle beep, not a warning tone, the full alarm, the one they'd trained for but never heard outside of drills. The computer system was flashing red. Missile launch detected. The screen showed 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles inbound from the United States. 5. The system had a confidence level. It was certain. The satellites had seen the heat signatures. The computers had done the math. The trajectory was calculated. Impact in minutes. The protocol was clear. You don't investigate. You don't second guess. You report immediately up the chain. The officer above you makes the call, then the officer above them, then the general, then the premier. And somewhere in that chain, someone decides whether to launch a counterstrike before the incoming missiles turn Moscow into a memory. The whole process was designed for speed. Because when missiles fly, you have minutes, not hours. Minutes. Petrov looked at the screen. 5 missiles. He looked at the other systems. Ground radar showed nothing. But ground radar was slower. It would take time to confirm. The satellites had already seen it. The computers had already decided. His hand was supposed to reach for the phone. His voice was supposed to say the words, "Missile attack in progress. Confidence level high. Recommend immediate escalation." But something felt wrong. Not wrong like a malfunction. Wrong like a story that doesn't make sense. If the United States was launching a first strike, if they decided to end the world before breakfast, why 5 missiles? The Americans had thousands. The whole point of a first strike is overwhelming force. You don't knock on the door with 5 missiles. You don't give the other side time to respond. You launch everything. You make sure there's no Soviet Union left to fire back. 5 missiles wasn't a war. It was a mistake. But the system wasn't designed to care what made sense. The system was designed to see and report. And the system was seeing. The alarm kept ringing. The screen kept flashing. The numbers kept updating. Every second he didn't pick up that phone was a second closer to impact. A second less for the generals to make their choice. A second stolen from the chain of command. The room was full of people now. Other officers, technicians, everyone staring at the same screen. Everyone waiting for Petrov to do his job, because that's what training is. You don't think. You do. You trust the system. You follow the protocol. Petrov had spent years learning not to hesitate. And now, with missiles in the air and the world counting down, he was hesitating. He looked at the ground radar again. Still nothing, but that didn't mean much. The missiles could be there, just not visible yet. Or the ground radar could be having issues, or 100 other things. The satellites were newer, more reliable, built specifically for this, and they were screaming that the missiles were real. Minutes passed. Not many, but enough. Enough for Petrov to think about what a real attack would look like. Enough to remember that the satellite system was new, untested in real conditions. Enough to weigh what he knew against what the computer knew. The computer had data, heat signatures, trajectories, confidence levels. Petrov had intuition, pattern recognition, the uncomfortable feeling that wars don't start with 5 missiles. He didn't pick up the phone. He waited. He told his staff to keep monitoring. He watched the ground radar. He watched the clock. He watched the screen showing 5 incoming missiles and a confidence level that never wavered. And he chose, in that moment, to believe that the system was wrong. It's hard to explain how much weight sits on a choice like that. If he was right, he'd saved time, prevented panic, kept the chain of command from making a decision based on false information. If he was wrong, he'd just given the United States free shots at Soviet cities. He'd let missiles land without warning. He'd broken every rule he'd sworn to follow. He'd failed at the one job that mattered most. The ground radar stayed empty. The minutes stretched. The alarm kept ringing, but the world kept turning. And slowly, carefully, the truth started to emerge. The satellite system had seen something, but it wasn't missiles. It was sunlight, reflected off high-altitude clouds at just the right angle, just the right position, just the right moment to look exactly like the heat signature of 5 rocket engines burning through the atmosphere. A glitch, a false alarm, a trick of light that almost ended the world. Petrov filed his report. Malfunction in the satellite detection system. No missiles detected by ground radar. Confidence level not supported by secondary verification. He didn't mention the minutes he'd waited, the choice he'd made, the protocol he'd ignored. He just wrote down what happened and what didn't happen and let the system decide what to do with him. The Soviet Union didn't thank him. They couldn't. Because thanking him meant admitting the system had failed, meant admitting that one officer's gut feeling was more reliable than 1 billion rubles worth of satellites and computers, meant asking uncomfortable questions about what might have happened if someone else had been sitting in that chair. Someone who followed the rules, someone who trusted the system, someone who picked up the phone. Petrov stayed in the military for a while. Then he didn't. His career never recovered, not because he was wrong, but because he'd been right in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. He'd shown that the system could fail, that the protocols could lead you toward disaster, that sometimes the most important thing an officer can do is nothing. He lived quietly after that, gave a few interviews, received a few awards years later from organizations that understood what he'd done, but mostly he just lived. Grew older, watched the Cold War end, watched the Soviet Union collapse, watched the world keep turning on an axis that almost stopped that night in September. The thing no one knew, the thing Petrov himself might not have fully understood in the moment, was how close it really was. Not close because the missiles were real, close because the system was designed to believe they were. Close because the protocols assumed the technology was infallible. Close because everyone else in that room was ready to follow the rules, and the rules led directly toward retaliation. 5 false missiles could have triggered 500 real ones. A computer error could have started a nuclear exchange, and the only thing standing between that error and that exchange was one officer who chose to wait. There's no perfect lesson here, no clean moral. Petrov wasn't a hero who saved the world through courage. He was a tired officer who made a judgment call based on incomplete information and got lucky. If the missiles had been real, he'd be remembered as the man who hesitated, the officer who broke protocol at the worst possible moment, the reason Moscow burned. But they weren't real. And because of that, because of minutes spent not following orders, not trusting the system, not doing what every regulation said to do, the sun rose the next morning. People woke up, went to work, had breakfast, complained about traffic, lived their lives without knowing how close they'd come to not having lives to live. Petrov died in 2017, 77 years old, in a small apartment outside Moscow. The world he'd saved barely noticed, because that's the thing about preventing disasters. You can't see what didn't happen. You can't measure the absence of nuclear war. You can't point to the cities that weren't destroyed, the families that weren't vaporized, the futures that weren't erased, but they weren't. And somewhere in that space between what almost happened and what didn't, between the alarm and the silence, between the protocol and the choice, one officer sat in a dark room and decided to wait. Not forever. Just long enough. Just long enough for the truth to catch up with the fear. Just long enough for the world to keep turning. The night didn't end with explosions. It ended with sunlight. Real sunlight. The kind that rises over cities still standing. Over people still breathing. Over a world that came within minutes of ending and didn't. Because someone chose to doubt the machine and trust the pattern. Because someone remembered that wars don't start with 5 missiles. Because someone waited.